The next item of business is a statement by John Swinney on the SQA exam results 2020. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of his statement, and so there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call on John Swinney for up to 20 minutes, please, Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, the COVID pandemic has inflicted much suffering and hardship on our society. Many of our young people have had to face that pain across different aspects of their lives. I want to make clear I understand that anguish, and I can see that for some, the SQA results process made that worse. We set out to ensure that the system was fair. We set out to ensure that it was credible, but we did not get it right for all young people. Before I go any further, I want to apologise for that. In speaking directly to the young people affected by the downgrading of awards, the 75,000 pupils whose teacher estimates were higher than their final award, I want to say this: I am sorry. But, Presiding Officer, sorry as I am, I know that an apology is not enough. I watched the pictures of the spirited, articulate young people demonstrating in George Square on Friday. I've spoken directly to pupils who wrote to me, to Nicole Tate, Lauren Steele, Eva Peterana, Erin Bleakley, Subin Baig and Ailey Breslin, and I want to thank them for the passion and the clarity that they brought to our discussions. And I've heard also from parents and teachers. I have listened, and the message is clear. They don't just want an apology, they want to see this fixed, and that is exactly what I will now do. Presiding Officer, the exceptional circumstances of this year meant it was not safe to hold exams in the spring. I said we would need to do our utmost to ensure that we protect the interests and the life chances of our young people who were due to sit exams. It has always been imperative that their achievements had to be rightly and fairly recognised. I wanted the 2020 cohort to be able to hold their heads high and gain the qualifications and awards that they deserve after many years of hard work. COVID meant that there was no established process for how to achieve this. All of this had to be developed at pace after we announced that schools required to close on the 20th of March. I asked the SQA to develop an alternative approach to certification to ensure that young people could receive awards this year. The SQA developed a model which gathered teachers' and lecturers' estimates in the absence of any other information and involved moderation of these estimates across all centres to maintain standards. This resulted in an increase in the pass rate at National 5 of 2.9%, at Higher of 4.2%, and Advanced Higher of 5.5%. Before I go any further, let me congratulate those tens of thousands of young people who achieved that strong result. But the system also meant that some people did not receive the awards that they felt they were capable of achieving and that their teachers believed they deserved. The focus has, understandably, been on the impact on young people from deprived backgrounds. The defining mission of this government is to do all that we can to improve the life chances of children and young people living in poverty, and we have focused intensely on that mission throughout this Parliament. The fact is, the results last week produced higher increases in the pass rates amongst young people from deprived backgrounds than from any other group. I commend these young people on their achievements, but that picture does not disguise nor detract from the clear anger and frustration amongst some young people and their families about the results. That anger stems from the unfairness they feel is at the heart of the model for certification that we put in place. This process relied on the professional judgment of teachers and lecturers, and we know that it was subsequently the case that the overwhelming majority, around 3/4 of these grade estimates, were not adjusted at all. This is a demonstration of the strength within our teaching profession, the sound understanding of standards across the suite of qualifications and through Curriculum for Excellence. I want to thank the teaching profession for the care and the attention which went into making every individual estimated grade. The estimates received in May showed an increase in attainment at grades A to C by 10.4 percentage points for National 5, by 14 percentage points for Higher, and by 13.4 percentage points for Advanced Hires. These estimates, if awarded without moderation, would have represented a very significant increase in the pass rate across the board and a one-year change without precedent in Scottish exam history. To ensure that they carried out what I asked of them, that the results were to be certificated on the basis of maintaining standards across all centres, the SQA judged that increases of this nature could not be sustained without moderation. Moderation is not a new process. It is an annual process and is widespread across all countries where exams take place. It helps to ensure that standards are maintained over time. In previous years, moderation was applied to quality assure centre assessment judgments of performance. This year, it was applied to teacher and lecturer estimates. The SQA have provided a significant amount of information regarding how their methodology works, which I will not restate again today. Some have called for this to have been done earlier, but every year, SQA provide the details of their marking methodology on Results Day. And whilst the methodology has changed this year, the principle remains the same of publishing on Results Day. The moderation methodology consisted of both national and local moderation and was robust and based on a number of principles which the SQA have set out. There was always going to be a risk with this approach that despite best efforts, some learners would see a grade adjusted in a way that did not reflect their own potential. That is why the SQA included an open, free appeals process from the outset in their approach. As a result of the SQA moderation process, 134,000 teacher estimates were adjusted, with just under 76,000 candidates having one or more of their grades lowered when compared to the teacher estimate. Despite the headline improvements in the pass rate at National 5, Higher and Advanced Higher, despite the fact that the pass rate amongst pupils in the most deprived areas increased at a sharper rate than those in the least deprived communities, and despite the fact that there was progress in closing the attainment gap, the results left many young people feeling that their future had been determined by statistical modelling rather than their own capability and capacity. That has left a feeling of unfairness in the minds of young people. I draw three conclusions from all of this. Firstly, we were concerned that grade inflation, through accepting the original estimates from teachers, would run the risk of undermining the value of qualifications in 2020. In the light of events and of listening to young people, we now accept that concern, which is not without foundation, is outweighed by the concern that young people, particularly from working class backgrounds, may lose faith in the education system and form the view that no matter how hard you work, the system is against you. Education is the route out of poverty for young people in deprived communities, and we cannot risk allowing that view to take hold. Secondly, there is a view that relying on teacher judgment this year alone may give young people an incomparable advantage with pupils in other years. That view has to be weighed against the massive disadvantage that COVID has given young people through the loss of schooling, limited social interaction, pressure on mental well-being, and in some cases, the heartbreak of bereavement. Perhaps our approach to maintaining standards for the 2020 cohort alongside every other year, even though 2020 is so unique, did not fully understand the trauma of COVID for this year group and did not appreciate that a different approach might actually help to even things out. And thirdly, this year is and must be seen as unique. 2020 has turned our society upside down, and it cannot fairly be compared to previous years, and nor can it set up an automatic precedent for future years. But it perhaps merits taking a different approach in relation to certification. Before I move on to how to resolve this issue, I want to be clear today about the role of the Scottish Qualifications Authority. As I've said already, I asked the SQA to ensure that the qualifications of 2020 would be comparable to the qualifications of any other year, despite the extraordinary times in which we are living. The SQA undertook the task I set them, and did so in good faith, and I make no criticism of their actions in so doing. I'm grateful to everyone at the SQA for the professional approach that they have taken. I will therefore now set out how I intend to resolve this issue. I can confirm to Parliament today that all downgraded awards will be withdrawn. Using powers available to me in the Education Scotland Act 1996, I am today directing the SQA to reissue those awards based solely on teacher or lecturer judgment. Schools will be able to confirm the estimates they provided for pupils to those that are returning to school this week and next. The SQA will issue fresh certificates to affected candidates as soon as possible, and importantly will inform UCAS and other admission bodies of the new grades as soon as practical in the coming days, to allow for applications to college and university to be progressed. As the First Minister confirmed yesterday, in those cases where moderation led to an increased grade, learners will not lose that award. Many of those young people will already have moved on to secure college or university places on the strength of the awards made to them. To unpick them now would not in any way be fair. Due to the unique circumstances of this situation, we will this year make provision for enough places in universities and colleges to ensure that no one is crowded out of a place they would otherwise have been awarded. The outcomes from the 2020 SQA National Qualifications this year will be updated, and a revised statistical release will be available from the 31st of August. However, I can confirm that the provisional revised 2020 results, based on the professional judgments of Scotland's teachers and lecturers, can be summarised as follows. A National 5 pass rate of 88.9%, this is 10.7 percentage points higher than 2019. A higher pass rate of 89.2%, 14.4 percentage points higher than 2019. And an advanced higher pass rate of 93.1%, which is 13.7 percentage points higher than 2019. I can also confirm that the final new headline results for National 5s and hires and advanced hires will be published by the 21st of August. A result of this change in approach to awarding qualifications means there will no longer be the need for exactly the same appeals process that was planned to consider cases where awarded grades were lower than teacher estimates. There remains the need for the option of an appeal in some circumstances, and detail on this will be set out by the end of the week. Presiding Officer, there are many lessons we need to learn from our experience through this pandemic and the difficult decisions we have had to make in unprecedented circumstances. The 2020 SQA results have sparked a lot of debate about the future of assessment and qualifications in Scotland and the best way to recognise learners' achievements. We have already commissioned the OECD to conduct an independent review of Curriculum for Excellence. A key focus of this exercise is curriculum design, and this already includes looking at our approach to assessment, qualifications and other achievements, and how well they articulate with the curriculum, learning and teaching. We will work with our partners at the OECD with a view to extending the remit of the Curriculum for Excellence review to include recommendations on how to transform the Scottish approach to assessment and qualifications based on best practice globally. Even before a broader review takes place, however, we need to quickly look at the immediate lessons of this year's awards process. Coronavirus has not gone away, and while we expect next year's exams to go ahead, we need to put in place the right plans to make sure we don't find ourselves in the same situation again. I'm aware that many teachers will be keen to understand fully the arrangements for national qualifications in 2021. The Education Recovery Group has discussed a number of options in relation to this, and I confirm that the SQA will begin a rapid consultation exercise on options for change later this week. This will include consideration of key issues such as increasing optionality in question papers, removing components of course assessment, and adjusting the volume of evidence required in coursework tasks. In addition, I'm today also announcing that an independent review will be led by Professor Mark Priestley of Stirling University. The review will look at events following the cancellation of the examination diet and the alternative certification model put in place by the SQA. Areas to be considered include the advice provided to awarding centres by the SQA and local authorities, the approach developed in relation to estimating learners' grades, teacher estimates, the moderation methodology used by the SQA, the proposed appeals process, the impact on young people and their families, transparency and the role of scrutiny in the process, and feedback received from teachers and lecturers on the grades awarded last week. Given the urgency, I have asked for an initial report with recommendations on how we should go forward this coming year within 5 weeks. These are exceptional times, and in exceptional times, truly difficult decisions have to be made. It is deeply regrettable that we got this wrong, and I am sorry for that. We have listened to young people, and I hope all will now feel satisfied that they have achieved the grades which their teachers and lecturers judged that they deserved. I assure Parliament that we will look to learn lessons from the process of awarding qualifications this year that will help to form any future actions. Finally, I would like to thank all of Scotland's children, young people and adult learners for the incredible resilience they have shown throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. We are immensely proud of all that they have achieved. I hope that our pupils now move forward confidently to their next step in education, employment or training with the qualifications that teachers or lecturers have judged were deserved. COVID has placed, at times, unbearable pressures on us all, and I wish our learners well in building on the achievements they have justified being awarded in these most difficult of days.
The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in his statement, and I will allow around 40 minutes for that. It would be helpful if members who wish to ask a question were to press the request to speak buttons now, and I first of all call on Jamie Green, who is joining us remotely. Mr Green.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I too want to thank teachers for their forbearance throughout this, and can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of his statement today. All 18 pages of it. The longest resignation speech in history, minus the resignation. Presiding Officer, in extraordinary circumstances, Mr Swinney promised us an exam system which would disadvantage no one. He promised dialogue, openness and fairness for all. But what did we get instead? A methodology clouded in secret, a lack of transparency and engagement. Teachers were ignored, a postcode lottery which disgracefully penalised those from our toughest communities the most, a grading process which put the system ahead of the individual, an endless denial that there was a problem with any of this. Just last week, the Education Secretary said there is no evidence that young people in deprived communities are being disadvantaged. He was backed by the First Minister the whole way. And today, both of them forced into an apology and this humiliating U-turn. But there remain questions to be answered, so let me ask the Deputy First Minister. First of all, who signed off the adoption of this methodology in the first place? Was it the Cabinet Secretary, the Cabinet, or the SQA? But more importantly, why was this flawed approach agreed, pursued and defended so vigorously by him and his government? Secondly, how will he physically ensure that those who are eligible for a university place will get one, given the implications of his comments today? And finally, whilst I welcome the announcement of a short-term inquiry into this fiasco, something which the Conservatives have been calling for, given the importance of the wider OECD review into Scottish education, will he now commit to bringing forward the publication of that vital report, and most certainly before May 2021?
John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, in relation to some of the earlier comments that Mr Green made, he made reference to the comments that I made last week about the fact that young people from deprived backgrounds had not been disadvantaged by the methodology that was taken forward. And the evidence I would cite for that is the evidence I used in my statement, which was at higher, for example, amongst the most deprived pupils in the most deprived communities, the pass rate increased by 4.6%. In the least deprived communities, it increased by 2.9%, demonstrating that the pass rate in the most deprived communities increased at a faster pace than in the least deprived communities. So that is the evidence for it, and I've set out in my statement the understanding that I have for the sense of hurt that young people who were predicted to do better but didn't get the awards that they were entitled to, that had to be addressed, and I've remedied that in my statement today. Now, on the question of the methodology, I want to be crystal clear about all of this. I set the SQA a task, and the task was to ensure that we maintained standards. I didn't prescribe how that was to be done because, and if I quote the words of Professor Lindsay Patterson, who's frequently cited by the Conservatives to me as an expert I should listen to. Professor Lindsay Patterson said at the weekend, politicians can't be seen to be interfering in examining. That would not be acceptable. That is why we have an independent SQA. Now, I'm conscious that I've just interfered in examining, so I put my hands up, and before the wise comics in the back of the Labour benches stumble onto that, I accept that point. But the point that Professor Patterson is making is that decisions have to be taken on examination standards by an independent body. And that's the arrangements here. So the government sets the task, saying that we want standards to be maintained, and the SQA developed the methodology to enable that to be the case. The approach was pursued because we had to replace the exams that were unable to happen. So that was why the methodology had to be put in place to enable it to be the case. In relation to the eligibility for university places, obviously, young people will be in many thousands of young people have had awards which have enabled them to take up places already, and there will be more young people who will be able to take up places subsequently to the announcement I've made today. And in relation to the OECD review will take place as soon as practically the OECD can undertake that task, given the travel restrictions that have affected us as a consequence of COVID. Now, the OECD are ready to take forward that work, and the government is entirely committed to that being undertaken at the earliest possible opportunity. But I've explained to Parliament before that the issues around the travel restrictions and the travel difficulties have prevented us taking forward that review in the early period that we would have envisaged.
Ian Gray.
Humiliating climb. This one is very, very welcome. The restoration of pupils' achievements based on the judgment of teachers who know them is a victory for fairness, for common sense, and above all for those young people who refuse to take this injustice lying down. But it begs so many questions about how on earth it came to this. Will the Education Secretary explain why he did not listen to warnings in April, in May, in June, in July, that this is exactly what was going to happen? And when it did happen, why did he not act immediately? Why did he defend the results of this moderation for 5 days? Why was there no contrition, no apology, no U-turn until now? Why did he leave these young people twisting in the wind for a week, hopes and aspirations in shreds? I commend him for taking responsibility now and trying to fix this, but I ask him, will he take full responsibility for it happening in the first place and resign?
John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, I take responsibility for my actions, and I've come here to do what I think young people in Scotland would want me to do, and that's to fix it. And I've done that right away at the earliest possible opportunity, and I've explained it to Parliament. And I've done that. I've done that openly and honestly in front of Parliament to make sure that Parliament could hear my explanation, which is my duty to make sure it is done here in Parliament. Now, I'm interested in the fact that Ian Gray welcomes the steps that we have taken and the approach that has been taken. I would simply point out to Ian Gray that the methodology that he has criticised here is a methodology that is being used in countless other jurisdictions around the world to address those issues, used in other parts of the United Kingdom and used in other parts of the world. But what we have recognised here is that the application of that methodology has created an injustice and an unfairness to young people, and I've come to Parliament to remedy it. I'm glad I've done it, and I hope that young people take heart from their action and their protest on these questions, that the government has responded to the points they've put in front of us.
We'll move now to open questions, and I have quite a lot to get through, so please bear that in mind. And I first of all call Claire Adamson to be followed by Ross Greer.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I thank the Deputy First Minister for his statement. There have been two reviews indicated into what has happened, one in the short term into the process this year, and a longer term review between the exams and teachers' assessment and whether we have that balance right. Can the Deputy First Minister ensure that the views of young people, of teachers, of employers and other stakeholders will be part of those reviews to ensure that we can have complete confidence across the board going forward?
John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, Claire Anderson raises an important point about the balance within our assessment system between exams and other forms of assessment. There is an absolutely legitimate discussion to be had there, and we can have that discussion within the review undertaken by the OECD, which will, of course, engage very widely within all of our education community in Scotland. And the review that Professor Mark Priestley will undertake will look specifically at the issues that I raised in my statement about this particular approach, and there will be engagement with young people and with a range of stakeholders as part of that process.
Ross Greer, followed by Willie Rennie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And like colleagues, I congratulate the pupils and teachers without whose campaigning over the last week this simply wouldn't have happened. And I welcome the fact that the Government have adopted all 4 of the proposals the Greens put to them to resolve this situation. But let's be clear, we should never have been here in the first place. So can I ask the Deputy First Minister, when he became aware of the number of grades lowered by moderation and the disproportionate number lowered in working class communities, why he didn't do something about it at that point? Does he regret the refusal to publish the methodology when it was twice requested by Parliament? And does he acknowledge that one of the many fatal errors in this process was the SQA's refusal to engage with teachers whose professional judgment the Cabinet Secretary regularly praises?
John Swinney.
On the specific point of when I became aware of the moderation outcomes, that was on Thursday before the results came out, when I was able to be given pre-release access to the statistics, and by that stage there is no conceivable way in which I could change the distribution of awards. And I also come back to the point that under our arrangements, the SQA is an independent awarding body which acts independently of government, and it would be inappropriate in those circumstances for the government to do that, although I accept I'm coming here to Parliament today to exercise my statutory powers of direction. On the second point, about the publication of the methodology, I appreciate that this is a point that Mr Greer has pursued on a number of occasions. But I explained the rationale for the SQA stance on that matter in my statement, that essentially the methodology is integral to the awarding process and therefore published on results day, along with the approach to marking, which would normally be, it was essentially the replacement to the marking approach that the SQA would normally have undertaken. And finally, on the issue of the engagement with members of the teaching profession, the SQA have set out that one of the difficulties of undertaking that engagement was the difficulty of ensuring that that could be undertaken on an equitable basis across all centres. There are about 500 centres that undertake some assessment, and they could not satisfy themselves that they would be able to fulfil their equalities duties across the board to all centres by the nature of the dialogue that Mr Greer raises with me, and that was the reason why that was not pursued.
Willie Rennie, followed by Jamie Halcrow-Johnson.
He embraces a solution that he trashed just last week. How can we have confidence in an Education Secretary who undermines our education system in such a reckless way? John Swinney told students the historical performance of their school would not affect their results, but it did. He was given another way, but ignored it. He was asked to publish the methodology early, but refused. He had plenty time to fix this, but didn't. Does John Swinney not understand that he is now part of the problem, not the solution?
John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, what I have done throughout this exercise is to try to ensure that young people in a situation of extremis were able to be awarded qualifications when they were unable to sit the examinations for which they were preparing. And that's a wholly difficult and inconceivable situation that we faced in a very short space in time. So what I did was respect the independence of the Scottish Qualifications Authority and set it the task, a very difficult task for that matter, of designing an approach to certification that respected the independence of the SQA and that would give young people the ability to have their achievements properly and fairly certificated on a comparable basis to other years. That is what the approach that we took. Now, I accept that as a consequence of all of that, young people have felt that, some young people have felt that their achievements have not been properly recorded and certificated. And I have now remedied that today, where I have listened and paid attention to the concerns that have been put to me. That is what I should do in difficult and challenging circumstances, and I'm pleased that we'll be able to rectify this matter on behalf of the young people that lent their bed to Scotland today.
Jamie Halcrow-Johnson, followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Parents, pupils and teachers believe that the Cabinet Secretary should have rejected out of hand the previous methodology for awards as soon as he saw how and where the impact of these changes would fall. We've just learned in his answer to Mr Greer that he actually has had an additional 5 days to decide whether to change or whether to challenge those results. And I would ask him to clarify in his answer why he chose to defend the impact that has become so apparent. But I'll also add that this whole sorry story and today's desperate U-turn could have been avoided if the initial methodology had been subject to proper scrutiny by the Cabinet Secretary ahead of being used. And with that in mind, can the Cabinet Secretary outline what consultation has taken place with external organisations on this new approach ahead of his announcement today, and any concerns that they have raised?
John Swinney.
Well, on the last point that Mr Halcrow-Johnson raises, this is a decision which has been arrived at after I have listened carefully to the views of young people, discussions with the Scottish Qualifications Authority, discussions I've taken forward with representatives of our universities, and listening to the views of teachers and parents as part of the process. So I have announced the decisions today which have been formulated as a consequence of that dialogue. Now, in relation to the points that Mr Halcrow-Johnson raises about the methodology, I come back to my fundamental answer that we have operated on the basis in Scotland, and it's not unique to Scotland, it's commonplace in many systems around the world, that awarding bodies operate independently of government. Government sets the task. The task which I set, I've been very open with Parliament, was that there should be a certification model developed that would maintain standards. And that is exactly what was developed by the SQA. It resulted, as I have said, in an increase in the pass rate. It resulted in an improved performance for young people from deprived backgrounds at a greater rate than those from the least deprived backgrounds. And as a consequence of that, it resulted in a closing of the poverty-related attainment gap. So on a number of those measures, the results indicated significant progress. But the methodology also recognised that there could be individual cases that were not that left young people feeling disadvantaged, and there was an appeals mechanism built into the approach from the very outset that would enable young people to appeal. So all of that was a system that was in place to enable the awards to be undertaken in circumstances where young people could not present their own work through the normal round of examinations.
Kenneth Gibson, to be followed by Daniel Johnson.
Cabinet Secretary's statement. Does he agree that in a display of breathtaking opportunism and cynicism, Tory and Labour MSPs have shown less concern for Scottish education or pupils in a desperation to attack this government? And had his initial action been different, these same MSPs would be jumping up and down, decrying a fall in standards, as they undoubtedly will next year, should the percentage of passes return to pre-pandemic levels. And looking forward, can he explain how adjusting the volume of evidence required in coursework will aid pupils from deprived backgrounds, given that they will not have access to tutors or, in some cases, active parental support that children from better-off families will enjoy?
John Swinney.
Part of the work with which Mr Gibson will be familiar that the government has taken forward is the work to specifically support young people from deprived backgrounds through the Scottish Attainment Challenge, where we are trying to ensure there is extra investment in schools with, where young people come from deprived backgrounds to support their attainment. So the government is actively trying to counterbalance the issue that Mr Gibson puts to me today. And he also highlights the question with which was at the heart of the direction I gave to the SQA some months ago about the maintenance of standards, that there had to be consideration given to the credibility of awards from one year to another. Now, I've accepted that in these exceptional circumstances that can be waived in the decisions that I've taken today, but it's a legitimate issue to be concerned about to ensure that young people can have quality in the standards of the qualifications that they are achieving.
Daniel Johnson, followed by Stuart McMillan.
Cabinet Secretary promised crystal clarity on the decision-making process, but I don't think we got that clarity. Can I ask if the Cabinet Secretary signed off on the use of a purely statistical method of moderation? And given that that decision was clearly of national significance, given the U-turn today, was that a decision that was signed off by the Cabinet, and when did that decision take place?
John Swinney.
Well, I thought I had given clarity at that point. The design of the methodology was the responsibility of the SQA to respond to the direction that I had given them to design a model which would maintain standards with comparable performance between individual years, as is the normal expectation of the SQA.
Stuart McMillan, to be followed by Liz Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I received a lot of correspondence from constituents about the SQA results, and I'm sure that they will be pleased with today's announcement and also statement. And it's also clear that the Scottish Government does listen to the population, and today's actions certainly demonstrate that. Can the Cabinet Secretary ensure, however, that no detriment for deprived communities is a foundation stone for the reviews that are about to take place?
John Swinney.
That issue lies at the heart, Presiding Officer, of the Government's policy agenda, and the closure of the poverty-related attainment gap, the steps that we are taking to invest heavily in the Scottish Attainment Challenge, the commitments that we have made to concentrate on tackling the issues that underpin the existence of the poverty-related attainment gap are the measures that we will take forward in education policy. What exam results will do and assessment results will do will be to capture the progress that we are making in that respect, and obviously I've set out some of the issues that we will have to wrestle with in the comparability of results between 2020 and other years as a consequence of the change to the approach that we've taken in awarding this year.
Liz Smith, followed by Ruth Maguire.
Thank you. Does the Deputy First Minister now accept that the utter fiasco of what happened last week has actually exposed fundamental failings in the whole system? The SQA is not nearly transparent enough. It is the only body in the UK that will not permit the scripts, the exam scripts, to be returned to the candidate and to the school. And will he review that so that we do not go through this lack of transparency again?
John Swinney.
Well, I'm very happy to raise the issue of exam scripts with the SQA, but there's a slight problem this year that there aren't any exam scripts to return to pupils because they didn't sit the exams. But I'm very happy to raise that issue with the SQA and to try to provide a satisfactory answer to Liz Smith.
Now, we're not going to get through all these questions if we don't have shorter questions and answers generally, please. And I call Ruth Maguire to be followed by Jackie Bailey.
Presiding Officer, can I thank the Deputy First Minister for listening and taking action, and ask whether going forward the SQA will assess the impact of moderation on all marginalised and disadvantaged groups?
John Swinney.
That is part of the statutory responsibility of the SQA in relation to its equalities duties, and the equalities impact assessment and the child rights impact assessment have all been published by the SQA and are of course available for scrutiny on this issue and will be undertaken in all future years.
Jackie Bailey, followed by Bob Doris.
Could I welcome the Cabinet Secretary's U-turn? Because it is important that we put individual students above an algorithm that simply ignored their hard work and the professional judgment of teachers. The remit of the review does not include examining the actions of the Scottish Government, but I believe it is essential that we understand what went wrong. So when the Cabinet Secretary was warned time and time again, did he ask questions of the methodology? Did he ask for it to be modelled? What direction did he give to the SQA before the results were published? Was there any attempt to stop the car crash? The Cabinet Secretary needs to publish all the papers and minutes to enable proper scrutiny. Will he now do so?
John Swinney.
Well, I'm sure that, whatever documentation we need to publish, we'll publish. But the point that I've made in explaining the approach to the design of the methodology is a very important one, because, as Jackie Bailey will know, the SQA is an independent awarding body. It is set up by government, but it's not controlled operationally by government. We have exceptional powers which I have used, but in the ordinary scheme of events, we believe it's important for examination results to be awarded by an independent body. And that's what's happened appropriately on this occasion. Now, obviously, we'll respond to any requests for information that we receive. But fundamentally, at the heart of this, the judgments that the SQA has to make is the ability to exercise independent decision-making on important issues of this type.
Bob Doris, followed by Beatrice Wishart.
Presiding Officer, I raise concerns with the Cabinet Secretary about how the appeals process may not deliver fairness for all pupils. I am pleased that today, with his actions, young people will no longer need to appeal. However, as we learn the lessons of this, will the Cabinet Secretary ensure there's an examination of all the elements which suppress the grades of some young people, particularly within deprived communities? And in that examination, can we have a look at the waterfall effect, where the SQA effectively set how many young people in Scotland will secure an A and subsequently downgrade across all grade groups, meaning many people in deprived communities have a lower grade?
John Swinney.
This is a question at the heart of all examination methodology on an annual basis, because if we, and this is the point of my statement about moderation, moderation is not a new issue. Moderation is applied on an annual basis to ensure that standards are maintained from one year to another. And that was what was the foundation of the approach that was taken here. Now, if we want to, as I've signalled in my answer, there are different ways in which we can assess performance. We have habitually operated on this basis. I think that basis has generally commanded confidence. Indeed, I've not had pressure on me as Education Secretary to change that methodology at any stage in the past. So I take from that Parliament has been confident in that methodology. Now, the OECD review can explore some of these questions and examine if that's the right way to proceed. As I say, there's a very legitimate debate to be had on that question, and the Government will happily engage in it.
Beatrice Wishart, followed by Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Does the Cabinet Secretary understand, after listening to all the questions from colleagues today, that he has let down so many people over the last 4 months and that he cannot be the person to take this new approach forward?
John Swinney.
Well, obviously, I take a different view to Beatrice Wishart, but these issues will be properly resolved through the processes of Parliament, and I'll leave Parliament to determine these questions.
Annabel Ewing, followed by Donald Cameron.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And as the MSP for Cowdenbeath constituency, I would like to say that I very much welcome the Cabinet Secretary's announcement today, for he has listened and he has acted. For the parents and young people in my constituency who have contacted me about concerns about downgraded results, can the Cabinet Secretary provide a bit more clarity as to when they may expect to receive intimation of the new grades, because they will be desperate for that oral and written confirmation? And also, could the Cabinet Secretary just clarify the status of the original Friday 14th August deadline for appeals? I would assume that in the generality that date is no longer of relevance.
John Swinney.
We'll set out further clarity later on this week of the circumstances which I expect to be much more limited in which appeals will be considered, because obviously we're taking a very different approach on awarding. In relation to the confirmation of results, schools will be able to indicate to young people the estimates that they submitted on behalf of individual young people, and the SQA will issue new certificates as soon as it is possible to do so. I can't give a definitive timescale to Annabel Ewing today, but I do assure Parliament that that will be done as quickly as it is physically possible to do so.
Joining us remotely is Donald Cameron, who will be followed by Neil Findlay.
One of the saddest stories this week was that of Eva Petarana, a pupil from Bambecula, whom the Cabinet Secretary just mentioned. I welcome that her grades will be amended, but young people in our island communities already face significant barriers in education. And in the wake of this fiasco and embarrassing U-turn, what urgent action will the SNP government take to ensure pupils like Eva are not placed at any further disadvantage?
John Swinney.
Well, President Officer, I had the pleasure of speaking to Eva yesterday, and one of the issues we discussed yesterday was the e-school which exists and which Eva has benefited from, also on Results Day. I spoke from Stonelaw High School with schools in Argyll, in Dunoon Grammar, to a young pupil who was involved in who had undertaken a psychology hire, which was not possible to be undertaken within Dunoon Grammar, but it was possible because of the e-school, which the government has funded in collaboration with Collier and Onion and Share. There were also young people involved in that video call from Forres Academy, from a Boyne Academy, and from Kirkwall Grammar School and the Nicholson Institute in Stornoway, who, along with Eva, are utilising the e-school, which is a tremendous investment in digital learning, which broadens subject choice for young people in remote communities, enables them to be able to take subjects which they ordinarily would not be able to take, and tries to overcome exactly the island and remote disadvantage that Mr Cameron has highlighted in his question. So it was a pleasure to see, or to use that technology and to see the practical benefits of it experienced by young people in schools such as Dunoon Grammar or in the schools that I mentioned in the answer that I just gave.
Neil Findlay, followed by Gillian Martin.
When the future of our young people in our poorest communities was at stake, the Cabinet Secretary refused to listen. But when the future of John Swinney was at stake, suddenly his inability to hear miraculously disappeared. The exams methodology is shattered and faith in the system battered. And the Cabinet Secretary and the First Minister were warned repeatedly, but arrogantly ignored these warnings. In the year 2000, Nicola Sturgeon called for the resignation of the then
Could you get to a question, please, Mr Findlay?
Then Cabinet Secretary over an error affecting 9,000 students. Today, John Swinney is still defending his policy
Could you get to a question, please, Mr Findlay?
75,000 students. I believe Mr Swinney is an honourable man.
Would you get to the question, please, Mr Findlay?
Will he do the honourable thing, take responsibility and stand down?
John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, I'm here to take responsibility. I've taken responsibility, I've listened and I've acted and I've fixed the issue that Mr Finlay is concerned about.
Gillian Martin, to be followed by Mark MacDonald.
The change to results that pupils and teachers have campaigned for will lead to more young people being able to go to university and college than would have been the case. And this is welcome given the very difficult experiences that young people have faced this year, particularly losing the vital months of face-to-face support. Deputy First Minister said in his statement that colleges and
Would you get to
universities
your question,
will
please,
review
Ms
their
Martin?
offers and accept those students. Can the Deputy First Minister outline his discussions with the HE and FE sector to ensure that these places will be available and resourced?
John Swinney.
So we've had discussions with the higher and further education sectors on these questions. There will be further guidance issued from the Scottish Funding Council, and obviously we are working to address some of the issues that arise out of that once we have a clearer idea of the number of places that will be involved and the support that will be required.
Mark MacDonald, who is joining us remotely, to be followed by Graham Simpson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary mentioned the long-term review, which will look at the assessment of pupils more generally and whether the balance is correct. Given that this situation appears to have demonstrated that pupils from more deprived backgrounds are traditionally disadvantaged by the closed book exam system, will the opportunity to completely do away with that as part of how pupils are assessed and do something radical and new, given that we constantly talk about adapting to a new normal, be up for consideration as part of that review?
John Swinney.
Mr MacDonald raises, as I've highlighted in my comments, an entirely legitimate view of how assessment should be undertaken. It's not the view that has predominated in the discussions so far in Scotland. I think there's an entirely legitimate debate to be had there. And I hope that debate will be had, because I think what the teacher estimates demonstrate, if we take, for example, the higher results amongst the most deprived communities, teachers believe that 85% of young people in those categories deserved to pass the exam, but the exam system in 2019 judged that 65% should pass the exam. So the point that Mr MacDonald raises highlights that difference in approach that is at the heart of this question, and I think there should be every opportunity for that to be explored as part of the review that we are undertaking.
Graham Simpson, to be followed by Sandra White.
Thank you. If there are any pupils who are still unhappy with their grades, will they be able to sit an exam?
John Swinney.
We have plans for an exam diet in this academic year. What we put in place was an appeals mechanism at the outset of this approach, which would enable young people to appeal. We're obviously will see a much narrower base and foundation for appeals that come as a consequence of that, but there are no plans to establish an exam in the autumn.
Sandra White, to be followed by Sarah Boyack.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. It's a slight follow-on from Mark MacDonald's question. Deputy First Minister, you mentioned long-term review and assessments. Well, this particular issue today with the young people who are not sitting in the exam is a prime example of the opportunity that they have got this time. Can I therefore ask the Deputy First Minister, would you look at following the progress of this year's pupils through college, university and employment, and to see whether this has led to greater opportunities for our young people?
John Swinney.
Yes, I will commit to that, Presiding Officer. I think Sandra White highlights an important issue that we would benefit from understanding, the implications of the decisions that we have taken, and her suggestion of monitoring the progress that those individual young people make is one that I will certainly pursue to ensure that we are aware of the progress that is able to be made as a consequence of this decision.
And the last question is to Sarah Boyack.
Many thanks, Presiding Officer. Can the Cabinet Secretary clarify that the additional places required for school students who now meet the entrance requirements will be fully funded, given the financial pressures our universities and colleges are facing?
John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, that's obviously an issue that we will take forward in discussion with the Scottish Funding Council, who are responsible on our behalf for dialogue with the institutions, and we will do all that we can to ensure that the young people who are able to access university or college are able to do so as a consequence of the announcements I've made today.
That concludes questions on the statement by John Swinney on the SQA exam results 2020, and we will shortly move on to the next item of business.